The most dumb Mount Everest deaths ever recorded. YouTube https://www.youtube.com/watch?mark v=byrp-wgqv12s. Transcript 00:00. The world's highest slopes remember every mistake, from a drone operator who stayed in the death zone, frost crusting over his camera as he fought to capture one last shot for his film, to a team that lingered too long on the summit ridge, laughing through thin air as storm fronts built unseen. 00:17. But first, the climber who refused goggles convinced the mountain should be felt, not filtered. It was May 14, 2016, on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest at roughly 27,600 feet. Morning sun reflected off the upper slopes with a sharpness that burned exposed skin within minutes. The air was perfectly clear. 00:45. No wind, no drifting spin drift, just the kind of deceptive calm that lures climbers into thinking the mountain has relented. Two figures advanced toward the south summit, moving on fixed rope across an icy traverse that had already claimed its share of frostbite cases that season. The man at the front, 33-year-old Ethan Larson from Colorado, had built an identity around natural mountaineering. He climbed with minimal synthetic layers, lightweight boots, and goggles that he usually left hanging from his chest strap. To him, the glass barrier dulled the experience, believing the mountain was meant to be felt, not filtered. His Sherpa partner Dorj had warned him repeatedly about the light at this altitude. UV radiation above 26,000 feet is magnified by snow reflection and thin air, often burning eyes in less than an hour. Ethan waved the concern away. The sky was spotless. Visibility, he said, was the best he'd ever seen. By mid-morning, that clarity turned against him. As the sun climbed, light refracted off the ice fields below the balcony and pierced the corneal tissue unprotected by his bare eyes. At first, the pain came as irritation, tearing and squinting. But within an hour, the freezing wind deepened the injury. Each blink felt like sand scraping across glass. Dra urged him to descend, but Ethan insisted it would ease up once they reached Camp 4. He slowed, pausing every few steps to rub his face with gloved fingers, unaware that the friction was worsening the frost damage around his eyelids. Not long after, he began missing footholds. The surface around 27,800 feet was firm but uneven, and his limited vision turned each step into guesswork. Dodge took over the lead, calling directions for him to follow, but Ethan's responses grew disoriented. He drifted toward the outer slope, still unclipping and recliner at the wrong anchor points. At one point, he turned completely around, convinced the descent was upward. Dra tried to secure him with a short rope they shared, but the distance between anchors forced him to move ahead and reset. For nearly 40 minutes, he shouted over the thin wind until the answers stopped coming. When other climbers reached that section later in the afternoon, they found a single ice axe planted upright beside the fixed line. 30 feet downslope lay Ethan's body, partially draped in his tether. His goggles were still clipped to his harness, the lenses coated in frost. Frostbite had clouded both eyes white, his pupils were unresponsive. Medical teams later estimated he'd collapsed from a combination of snow blindness and hypothermic exhaustion. The following morning, Georgia returned with a recovery team, but shifting weather forced them to leave him secure to the rope at 27,600 feet, a common practice for unrecoverable remains in the death zone. His position was later confirmed through reports from other expeditions passing the same route that season, who noted the body anchored near the fixed line. For all his talk about connecting with the mountain, Ethan never realized that exposure isn't purity, it's risk multiplied by arrogance. On Everest, even something as simple as refusing a pair of goggles can strip a climber's vision, direction, and life within the same clear morning. He believed clarity meant connection, that sight itself made him closer to the mountain. Yet blindness took him before he even began his descent. 3 years later, another climber would also trust his vision too much, not to see with his eyes, but through the lens of a machine that failed him in the same thin air. It was May 21, 2018, on the upper southeast ridge of Mount Everest, just above 28,000 feet. The morning started deceptively calm, with faint wind ripples across the fixed lines and a streak of pale blue sky over the south summit. Visibility stretched for miles across the Tibetan plateau. To the climbers preparing for their final ascent, it looked like the perfect summit day, clear, still, and bright. Yet weather readings from Camp 4 had already begun, showing signs of the jet stream shifting east. The barometric pressure had begun to drop sharply, and oxygen levels were falling faster than expected for that time of morning, an early sign that the jet stream was moving closer. Within hours, gusts of over 60 miles per hour were expected to roll over the ridge. Among those climbing that morning was 29-year-old Jason Kearney, a tech vlogger from Seattle known for blending adventure travel with camera gear reviews. He had built a modest following online by documenting extreme environments with drones and action cameras. His expedition wasn't commercial. He had joined a smaller independent team that hired Sherpas only for logistical support. Jason's goal was to capture summit-level footage, not from the very top, but from the upper slopes near the South Pole. Earlier in the climb, he had managed a brief test flight around 23,000 feet, where the drone lifted but fought to stay stable in the thin air and cold. That small success convinced him he could handle one more attempt higher up. His Sherpa guides warned him that the upper reach often turned without warning once the jet stream began shifting. One of them reminded him that the mountain punished anyone who lingered too long, but Jason brushed it off. He trusted the readings on his controller more than the mountain's silence. Convinced that data and preparation outweighed instinct, the conditions that morning looked deceptively stable. He waited for a lull, unfolded the drone beside a rock ledge, and powered it on. The thin air and cold immediately affected the motors. Propeller spun unevenly and the feet flickered. Within seconds of takeoff, a crossgust from the jet stream hit the ridge. The drone veered sideways, lost lift, and vanished into the cloud forming below. Jason stared at the controller, watching the battery indicator plunge to zero as the signal dropped out. The others began their descent as the wind rose sharply. White mist thickened into a low cloud, blurring the fixed ropes. Jason stayed where he was, crouched on the ridge, insisting he could still retrieve the footage. The small beacon light on his drone's controller blinked weakly, connection lost. Instead of following the ropes back down, he unclipped and moved toward where he believed it had fallen, about 65 feet off the main path. His Sherpa shouted for him to return, but the words dissolved in the wind. For nearly an hour, Jason drifted between outcrops, sweeping his gloved hand across the snow in short arcs. Visibility shrank to just a few feet, the horizon vanished entirely. The ridge and sky merged into a single gray blur, and the air filled with fine ice crystals that stung his skin and clung to his gloves. The wind flattened sound until even his own breathing seemed distant, muffled by the storm. Oxygen levels fell dangerously low, and his regulator began to hiss unevenly as ice built inside the valve. When the others reached the South Pole, they realized he hadn't followed. A second team, ascending later that afternoon, reported seeing a lone figure kneeling near a narrow crease, still holding a controller, his movements slow and disoriented. By the time rescuers reached that section the next morning, the weather had sealed the ridge in cloud and high wind. His body was found a day later near the balcony, half buried in wind-blown snow, his right hand still gripping the drone controller. His mask hose was detached and his oxygen cylinder had run empty. The drone itself was never located, likely swept into one of the lower gullies. His team logged the coordinates and marked the spot with an ice axe before descending to Camp 2. For a climber who trusted machines to conquer altitude, Jason Kearney vanished not in darkness or storm, but within the clarity he tried to capture. Everest took him in full daylight, his final image frozen mid-frame. And if some vanish chasing the perfect view, what becomes of those who are taken while standing still, with no motion, no warning, and nowhere to fall but through silence itself? It was April 3, 2017, on the upper conch face of Mount Everest, at roughly 25,000 feet. The night air was unnaturally still, a thin, brittle calm that carried every sound. The faint ticking of cooling metal, the soft creak of ice beneath the tent floor. The sky had cleared after 2 days of low cloud, revealing a waning moon that reflected off the slope's glassy surface. To most climbers, the conditions looked unstable. The snowfield below Camp 3 was heavily corniced, and the wind had carved hollow cavities beneath the ridgeline. For one man camped near the edge, it was the perfect opportunity for a photograph. The climber was 37-year-old Thomas Wright, a British alienist and documentary photographer who preferred working alone. Known among peers for his precision and patience, he had spent years documenting Himalayan peaks from less traveled faces, avoiding commercial routes and summit crowds. His current expedition was a small mixed-nationality team attempting the Kong face, Everest's eastern wall, notorious for its ice fluting and unstable snowpack. While the others camped farther inland along the slope, Wainwright had moved his tent closer to the cornice lip, explaining that he wanted a clear, unobstructed view of the sunrise for a time-lapse project. He had been filming throughout the climb. The Team Sherpa coordinator had quietly objected. The overhanging ridge had shown new fracture lines after the last windstorm. Creases beneath the surface had widened and several ice screws near the lip had begun to shift. Wainwright acknowledged the warning, but argued that his tent anchors were secure. He had installed 2 additional screws and tethered the shelter to a fixed picket driven into the ice. From a technical standpoint, his setup looked clean and deliberate, typical of his careful style. What he could not see was the weakness forming beneath the corner shelf, a cavity where meltwater from the previous week had refrozen into a brittle layer. As darkness deepened, the temperature dropped below -13 degrees Fahrenheit. The snowpack contracted, tightening around the tent's anchors with audible pops. Inside, Wainwright reviewed his footage by headlamp, adjusting the intervalometer on his camera for a dawn sequence. He secured it on a small tripod at the tent's entrance. Lens aimed toward the eastern horizon, where the first light would spill over Makalu. The rhythmic flutter of the fabric against the wind faded as the ridge fell silent. Sometime after 2 a.m., a minor tremor passed through the slope, possibly a distant Sirac release from above. The vibration propagated through the frozen layers, unsettling the delicate balance of the overhanging cornice. A faint cracking sound followed, muffled at first, then sharper. The rightmost ice screw twisted slightly as the ice beneath it sheared. Wainwright stirred, unzipping his bag to check the line tension, unaware that the snow layer directly under his vestibule had fractured into a void. When dawn light began to appear, the temperature shift triggered expansion in the upper crust, forcing the fracture to propagate. At approximately 5:42 a.m., the cornice segment gave way. The tent, still tethered to its anchors, slid as a single unit over the edge, dragging its occupant and camera with it. The initial fall was short, about 15 feet, before the ropes tightened and swung the tent outward into space. The entire assembly then dropped again when the second anchor failed, bouncing down the slope and catching on a protruding serac roughly 200 feet below. The time-lapse camera, still recording, captured the sudden jolt and tumble. For several minutes, the lens pointed upward at a skewed angle, showing fragments of flapping fabric and the dim glow of morning light breaking through thin cloud. The footage ran for 47 minutes before the battery exhausted. The final frame froze on a blurred image of snow particles drifting past the lens. When the main team woke at Camp 3, they noticed his absence, but assumed he had begun an early photography session. Only when daylight strengthened did they see the torn outline of the cornice where his tent had been. A faint trail of disturbed snow led to the edge, ending in a gap that opened into shadow. The Sherpa coordinator immediately descended with 2 others, probing the slope with poles until they spotted orange nylon far below. Ropes were fixed from an anchor point above the break, but reaching the tent proved impossible. The serac it rested on was cracked and overhanging open air. Aerial reconnaissance from a helicopter later confirmed the tent's position and partial burial. The risk of collapse prevented retrieval. The footage card was recovered weeks later when a section of debris slid lower onto a more stable ledge discovered by a later expedition. Thomas Wainwright's footage was examined posthumously. It showed the pale band of first light over the Himalaya, the faint silhouette of Makalu rising in the distance, and then the abrupt drop that ended both the sequence and the man behind it. Not every death on Everest comes in darkness or from exposure at altitude. Some are claimed far lower, where the air is thick and the danger looks ordinary, where a single step of the marked route can turn a shortcut into a trap. An experience itself becomes the reason no one turns back. It was April 18, 2015, on the lower Khumbu icefall of Mount Everest, around 18,000 feet above sea level. The morning light filtered through hanging spires of ice, scattering soft blue reflections across the frozen maze. Climbers from multiple expeditions were already lined along the main route, waiting their turn to cross a series of aluminum ladders stretched over yawning creases. The icefall was alive with sound, groaning ice, distant pops from shifting, and the occasional clatter of metal against rock. Beneath the stillness, the glacier itself was moving, sliding slowly but relentlessly toward the valley below. Among the climbers was 46-year-old expedition leader Robert Hensley, a veteran American mountaineer known for his efficiency and impatience with bureaucracy. He had summited Everest twice before, both times as part of guided commercial teams. This year, he had brought his own small group of clients under a private permit. His plan was to reach Camp Wine ahead of the bottleneck forming at the icefall ladders, a familiar choke point that often delayed climbers for hours. Hensley believed the main route, fixed and maintained by the icefall doctors, had become too crowded and inefficient. He argued that the glacier shifted so rapidly that approved paths were only marginally safer than any other well-scouted corridor. At dawn, while most climbers queued at the first ladder crossing, Hensley directed his team to veer left toward a section of the glacier marked as closed by faded red flags. The decision saved them time. Within minutes, they were alone, threading between towering saracs that glowed faintly in the sunlight. The walls of ice rose more than 40 feet high on either side, narrowing into a corridor littered with small chunks that crackled underfoot. It was a route rarely used for good reason. The area was beneath an unstable ice bulge known to shift after warm spells. But the night had been cold and the early morning seemed calm. Hensley's Sherpa liaison Pasang hesitated before following. He had crossed this glacier more than 100 times and knew the patterns, the low thuds, the subtle shifts in sound that signaled tension within the ice. But Hensley pressed forward, setting ropes along the edge of a shallow crease and hammering in snow pickets as temporary anchors. The others followed, moving carefully across the uneven floor. Around 6:40 a.m., Pasang noticed a fine mist rising from the corridor ahead. A faint plume of snow dust barely visible against the sunlit air. It was the first sign of trouble. Seconds later came the sound, a sharp crack from above, followed by a low, rolling boom that reverberated through the canyon of ice. Hensley turned in time to see a shadow sweep across the path. A serac larger than a house had detached from the wall above, breaking into sections as it fell. The first impact struck the glacier floor about 50 feet ahead of them, releasing a blast of powder and fragments that filled the corridor. Another section broke loose seconds later, cascading directly into their path. The air pressure alone knocked climbers off balance, shattering one of the ladders and tearing loose the fixed ropes. The collapse continued for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity inside the icefall before the echoes faded into silence. When the snow settled, the corridor was gone. Where the narrow passage had been was now a mound of shattered ice blocks, some as large as trucks. The debris was unstable and occasional slabs continued to slide and grind. The main route, less than a fourth mile away, remained intact. Climbers there felt the tremor but couldn't see what had happened. Radio operators picked up fragments of a distress call before static consumed the signal. Pasang's transmitter was damaged and his voice cut out mid-sentence. Rescue teams from multiple expeditions began preparing to descend, but the icefall was still shifting. It took more than 4 hours for the first responders to reach the area, moving slowly across new cracks and collapsing snow bridges. By then, there were no survivors. Hensley's group had been buried beneath more than 20 feet of compacted ice. One climber was found partially exposed, helmet crushed, harness still clipped to a snapped rope. A red pack was recovered near a fissure where the ice had split apart. A marker that guided rescuers to the rest of the debris field. Days later, as the glacier continued to move, search teams found a broken series of route markers staked into the ice. GPS readings confirmed that the team had deviated only about 650 feet from the approved path. Had they followed the main route, they would have been on the opposite side of a natural ridge that absorbed most of the collapse. Robert once described Everest as a place that rewarded initiative, but on the Khumbu icefall, initiative can't outthink movement. The glacier shifts on its own schedule, erasing shortcuts as quickly as they appear. He did not vanish in a blizzard or from exhaustion near the summit. He died in seconds beneath collapsing ice, buried before he could even call for help. But if the mountain can kill without warning in a single strike, what happens to those it spares for a while longer? Letting triumph turn slowly into tragedy, one delayed decision at a time. It was May 29, 2021, on the south summit ridge of Mount Everest, roughly 28,700 feet above sea level. Afternoon light stretched long over the Tibetan plateau, gilding the upper slopes with a shallow glow. The summit winds, come through most of the morning, were beginning to rise. Light plumes of snow drifted from the cornices, curling away like smoke. Forecast bulletins from base camp had warned of a jet stream surge moving in from the west, with gusts exceeding 40 miles per hour after 400 p.m. But on the ridge, celebration outweighed caution. The four climbers, Sanjay Gurung, Ritesh Bandari, Kiran Lama and Moapa, had reached the summit later than planned at 3:40 p.m. For Sanjay, a 32-year-old software engineer from Pokhara, the climb marked years of quiet preparation and savings. Raichis, 34, a freelance videographer, had secured small sponsorships from outdoor brands in exchange for footage. Kiran, 30, was a former trekking guide making his first attempt above 26,000 feet. Nurmal, 33, managed logistics for the group and had organized their permits under a limited support arrangement. Few Sherpas, lighter loads and minimal backup oxygen. The late hour meant the margin for error was gone. The summit, normally cleared by midday, was already emptying as clouds thickened below. Yet, Ritesh insisted on filming short clips for their followers. He unpacked his phone, set it to record, and asked the others to stand together for a final summit moment. Each took turns filming panoramas and voice messages through their masks, tagging sponsors and friends. Their oxygen cylinders hissed softly in the background, gauges showing less than 1/3 capacity. Rajesh suggested a short livestream before descent, just one more minute for the audience back home. The others hesitated, but Sanjay nodded. They lingered nearly 90 minutes above 28,900 feet, alternating between filming and posing while the weather line crept closer. Gusts intensified, driving snow sideways and freezing around their mask valves. The bright light dulled to gray and the summit ridge dissolved into fog. By 5:15 p.m., visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The fixed line leading back toward the south summit vanished into white haze, and their headlamps reflected off swirling snow. Nurmal went first, trying to locate the anchor, but the rope was already buried. Kiran followed, clipping by touch, while Sanjay and Ritesh stayed behind to check the second line near the cornice. A sudden gust hit, strong enough to stagger them. Ritesh shouted for Sanjay, but his voice vanished in the wind. When the storm subsided hours later, only Kiran and Nirmal were alive, sheltering behind an ice bulge near the balcony. Their oxygen was nearly gone, masks frozen with condensation. A Sherpa team from Camp 4 reached them at dawn, escorting them down through broken fixed lines and waist-deep drift. Days later, rescuers found Sanjay and Ritesh still roped together beneath the ridge. Their phones held the final clips, snow sweeping over the lens, muffled voices, and the hiss of wind smothering their words. The timestamps read 5:19 p.m., minutes before the whiteout engulfed the route. Their footage spread widely online, circulated across climbing forums and regional news sites. For climbers, it became a cautionary echo. On Everest, triumph ends the moment celebration begins. Every minute above safety is borrowed time. Thanks for watching. Enjoy this video. Click more.